Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Brendan Cole. Now, final results may not be known yet, but Libya's first free national election for 60 years passed off relatively peacefully. Early results suggest a Liberal National Forces alliance was doing better than Islamist parties. The 200-member assembly will elect a cabinet and a prime minister before laying the groundwork for full parliamentary elections next year. On voting day, there were pockets of unrest in the east. Where there were fears the region will be underrepresented in the new temporary assembly being elected. But Sunday was declared a holiday amid celebrations and a 60% turnout. But what will this election mean for the future of Libya? What makes it different from other countries caught up in the Arab Spring? And how will a country function under this new system where democracy has been absent for so long? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Nureddin Waiheishi. He's a member of the Libyan community in London, and he's been exiled from Libya for over 30 years. Dr. Alan George, he's a Libya specialist at St. Antony's College at the University of Oxford. And also on the line, we have Dmitry Babich. He's the Voice of Russia's observer on the line from Moscow. Well, first of all, I'll turn to you, Nureddin. Describe for me how you felt when you saw the scenes in the Libyan capital and throughout the country.
Well, first of all, I felt joyous, happy, a historic moment. We not to forget that 1.5 years or just over a year ago, Libya was under a dictatorship. Now, the Libyan people move into the right direction toward democracy. I know the world is looking at it, and most of the observers think everything is gone smoothly. And so all in all, it was a happy moment and a very, very historical moment.
Dr. Alan George, I'll turn to you from Oxford University. It must have been hard for Libyans to decide between the candidates. I mean, we're talking about thousands of candidates. How do you think people in Libya actually knew who to vote for?
The candidates obviously undertook their own campaigns, their own election campaigns, and I think the Libyan people have a pretty good idea of the main currents, even under the dictatorship of Gaddafi. For example, there was an Islamist movement in the broadest sense. Likewise, there were liberal tendencies. So I think the parties and the candidates in the elections that have just taken place reflect underlying political trends that have been present actually for a long time.
Do you think it was easy for Libyans to understand the intricacies of what democracy actually means for them? I mean, it's and also, more importantly, its flaws.
Even in the UK, one of the oldest democracies, it's a constant struggle to maintain the democratic line, if you like. People with power tend to want more power. Now, there isn't, of course, a culture of democracy in Libya in the sense that they've had a democracy for a very long time. It's something that's going to evolve. But when I hear suggestions that maybe the Libyans aren't ready for democracy, they don't have a tradition, you have to ask, what's the alternative? Endless military dictatorship? I don't think so. So I think this was really a historic moment. Of course, there are all sorts of challenges, all sorts of problems that need to be resolved. But without this threshold that is now, it seems, being crossed, the outlook would have been pretty grim.
Dmitry Babich in Moscow, I'll turn to you. How is this being viewed in Russia? Russia were a little bit backward. They didn't particularly want military intervention in Libya. Are they happy with the course of events?
Even if you look at some of the press reports from Libya, you don't get the same festive feeling that I hear from the other participants, because obviously there is a lot of militia violence. There was a moment recently when militia indeed took the Tripoli airport under its control. People are killed sometimes in intertribal violence. And even during this election, there were attacks against the electoral officers, and the East is obviously demanding more autonomy from the government in Tripoli. So I don't think the situation is indeed that rosy. Obviously, we in Russia, we lived under a leftist dictatorship for 70 years, so we know what it is, and we want Libyan people to live in democracy and peace. But I would even put it in the reverse order, in peace and democracy. There is still a lot of militia violence. We're not so optimistic. I'm not sure that just a mere vote can bring stability and happiness to a country.
Nureddin Waiheishi, I'll turn to you. I guess what the Western media has been concentrating on in the last few weeks is ethnic quarrels breaking out in several parts of the country. How likely is it that a new government can ease these ethnic tensions?
Okay, I'll answer that quickly, but I'll go back to what the gentleman said from Russia. First of all, this government is going to be legit government. It's going to have mandate from the people. It's going to be the voice of people. So that will give it the authority to handle the problem better than any military ruling government. So I am very optimistic, and I think the solution will happen because, like I said, the authority of this government is going to be coming from the people of Libya. Yes, I'm not going to sit down here and deny there is a problem. There is a friction. But, you're looking at the big picture here. There's nearly 6 million people in Libya. There is a fractionally low number of people making those problems. This is not the whole society of Libya. This is a small problem happening there and there. But the main thing is Libya moving to the right direction, moving toward democracy. And like Dr. Allen said, what they want us to do, be under military rulership for how long? Democracy is the right things, and I think, yes, Saturday election was just the beginning of it.
The militias, they were instrumental, I guess, in overthrowing the Gaddafi regime in the first place. But since Gaddafi has been overthrown, Amnesty International produced a report last week that said that they actually threaten the future of the country. Earlier on, I spoke to Diana El-Tahawi, a Libyan researcher for Amnesty International.
I've visited about 20 detention facilities in May and June of this year. Some of them official prisons, but other detention facilities run directly by these armed militias. And I spoke to dozens of detainees, many of whom told me that they were beaten and tortured with various implements. But what's a real concern is that even in those cases where people complain, for instance, about torture or families of those who have died, the authorities have not taken any concrete steps to actually prosecute these crimes.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. We're discussing the outcome of the Libyan election. With me is Nureddin Waiheishi. He's a member of the Libyan community in London, exiled from Libya for 30 years. Also in the studio is Dr. Alan George. He's a Libyan expert at St. Antony's College at Oxford University. And on the line from Moscow, we have Dmitry Babich. He's the Voice of Russia's in-house observer. Okay, well, you can easily make the point that that's not democracy's fault. But key to democracy working in Libya is a new government being strong enough to rein in those militias. Do you have confidence that that can happen?
Absolutely, 100%. The NTC at the moment wasn't elected head of the state. And that's always the argument, who bring you to power. So with the new government, like I said, take its power from the people. They will tackle this problem. This problem, it's minority, and it's happening, and we're not denying that it's happening. But it's gonna disappear. Don't forget, Gaddafi was in power for 42 years. Demolished the humanity of people. So at the moment, the Libyan, there's just humanity, it's waking up in them. It's a hangover from the Gaddafi regime. It's still people thinking that there is nothing. They know nothing but the Gaddafi regime. I know that's the way they deal with people, and unfortunately, it's sad, but that's the reality. But it's going to disappear.
Well, that's a fair point, isn't it, Dmitry Babich in Moscow, that of course there's going to be this interim period where there will be some kind of violence, but the alternative is even worse.
The losses inflicted by the civil war were indeed tremendous. I can only express hope that in future there will be no airports taken by militias. There will be no trials like the one that we had when Ukrainian nationals who were working in Libya were actually sentenced to a very long prison term. And I'm also a little disturbed by the fact that under the new government, it was prohibited to condemn the revolution. It was prohibited to justify the old regime. Of course, I don't want to justify the old regime, but in Russia we had a similar situation when from 1917 onwards, it was illegal to say that life before 1917 was better. I wouldn't like such a destiny for Libya.
Let's move on to the de facto winner here, Mahmoud Jibril. People say that they voted for him, but he wasn't actually on the ballot paper. Dr. Alan George from Oxford University. What does he stand for?
What he stands, it's being summarised in the word liberal. The meaning of that, I think, taken in context, is that he's not avowedly Islamist in the way, for example, that the Muslim Brotherhood is, but he himself has made the point that his alliance would wish, for example, to have elements of Islamic law as the basis of Libyan law. So he's reaching out, if you like, to the Islamic tendency, and of course he's also called for a grand coalition representing all the forces in Libya, which is a potential way forward, I have to say. I mean, his background, of course, he was the last prime minister under Gaddafi, or the last but one. He defected to the rebels and was a major contact point for the Western powers helping in the overthrow of Gaddafi.
Although he defected to the rebels, he is connected tangentially to the previous regime. Do you think that will damage him?
No, I don't think so. I think Libyans are perfectly capable of knowing who was abusive under the old regime, who was responsible for torture and all the rest of it. And I think they know that under the Gaddafi system, perhaps as it was in the Soviet Union, you had to be a part of the system. There was actually no alternative. It was the only thing that was available. May I just correct a small point from Dmitry? I think the law that was indeed reprehensible, banning Libyans from glorifying the Gaddafi era, has actually been overthrown or turned back. Yes. So that's no longer on the statute book. On the question of militias and torture and all the rest of it, as I said earlier, of course there are tremendous challenges. The NTC, the National Transitional Council, simply could not function as a central government for all sorts of reasons. It had no legitimacy. It inherited, if you like, or it oversaw a country that was nothing much more than a collection of militias as a result of the evolution of the uprising of the civil war. To say that the NTC, the existing or just prior government, tolerated torture and all the rest really is a false description, in the sense that it was not able to do anything about it. In the absence of a functioning national police force, a functioning national army, a functioning national judicial system, it's really impossible to see what they could have done. The militia violations and abuses are utterly reprehensible in my view. There are appalling stories indeed, as Amnesty have reported, not just recently, but actually during the unrest, during the uprising, the torture, the arbitrary arrests, the disappearances. These are shocking, and I would not expect them to be part of any democratic Libya. In fact, they would be an utter contradiction to such an institute.
Do you think, Nureddin Waiheishi, potentially in the months to come we will see religious language reintroduced into the domain of politics, and perhaps candidates who hid their Islamist tendencies perhaps during the course of the campaign might reveal them later on?
Religion is a very important part of the Libyan society. It's an everyday dealing. Even the liberal, they all have a connection with the religion. I don't think that the Libyan will gonna fall for somebody who's gonna hide his agenda or motive behind the religion. I think they are capable, and I think the more experience they're going to have in democracy, the more aware they're going to be of those things. And
but was there concern that Islamists would come to power, or was there no concern at all in that sense? Islamist, inverted commas, with a small I perhaps, but not the kind of Islamists that we know.
Yes, and I think there is a concern for some people. There is a concern for because one of in addition to Libya to have a democratic system, they want to have a good relation with the whole world, especially with the Western world, who helped them to throw the Gaddafi. So they know those sensitive points, and they know that there is a point they cannot, for example, they cannot afford to lose, and having extreme Islamic government is one of them.
Just my final point actually on Jibril and the possible consequences of his winning. I guess there was a report in yesterday's Libya Herald that how a prominent Libyan politician claimed that revolutionaries had been meeting across the country to discuss possible action should Jibril win, because a victory for him, in their words, would be a theft of their revolution. I mean, is that a cause for concern?
It is I don't think it's true. If that's true, it is a cause for concern. But I think the Libyan people have voted, and the Libyan people have their say. And I don't think that will move it any other way.
Alan George from Oxford University, let's talk about how the new government will be configured. The 200-seat National General Congress, it will have 120 seats reserved for independent candidates. It'll have 80 seats for parties. The majority of these people who will be in that scenario will have very little political experience. Can Libyans be assured that these representatives will represent them competently?
One can either be optimistic or pessimistic, I think. I would tend to be cautiously optimistic. Libyans may not have direct political experience, but they are politically very aware. And I think there is a widespread sense of responsibility, of the gravity of this phase that the country is going through. There's a sense that they've got to get it right. That's not to say that there are people at the margins who might try and disrupt, who might, as you said earlier, take the view that the politicians are stealing the revolution. This is why I think the vote that's just taken place is so important. It does marginalise extremist groups very effectively. Only time will tell. As I say, one can be optimistic or pessimistic. I'm cautiously optimistic.
Can I just add one thing? And I totally agree with Dr. Allen here, but we have to start. There is a 0 point here. We have to start somewhere.
That's right.
People, you cannot sit down and say, we don't know anything about democracy. We have to leave it. We have to start learning. We have to start moving to that direction. Okay, the first year, 2-3 years, it's teething problems. But it's going to be solved. People are going to learn. Electors, they're going to learn how to elect. Lobbies going to happen better. So, let's just start. That's the main thing. We're starting now.
But what about the Federalists? They say that that there's an unfair distribution of seats in the new National Congress. I mean, are their concerns justified in this sense?
No, totally rubbish. I mean, the way that the seats has been divided, it's population of people. And it's just happened in west of Libya. There is more people living than the east of Libya, so they have to have more seats. The fact Tripoli is the capital, it have to have more seats. It's like London. There is more seats in London than in Scotland and Ireland and Wales put together. But that I think this is just people who trying to make a trouble. They're trying to trying to stop the democracy going to Libya.
I'll turn to you, Dmitry Babich, in Moscow. I guess Western countries will be looking at this vote, but they'll also be they'll have an eye on the oil fields in Libya, won't they? I mean, how do you think a country like Russia, which had a lot of trade, for instance, with Libya under the Gaddafi regime, and I'm talking really weapons here, how will it view Libya as a trading partner?
Well, Russian presence in Libyan economy was already much more inferior to the Western presence by the end of Gaddafi rule. These were actually Western oil companies and Western gas companies that were extracting most of the oil there. Judging by very few reports that appear in the Western press, the country is not yet stable, and we are not yet poised for an economic boom there. In general, it's quite clear that the mainstream press in the West is trying to make things better than they are, because if the situation had been so good, probably we would see a very quick rise in production. When Gaddafi managed to make peace with Western countries several years before his fall, the development of the Libyan economy was just staggering, when sanctions were lifted. I think Russia would, of course, like to have trade relations with all the Arab countries, including Libya, independent of the regimes that they have. But in general, my optimism is somewhat limited.
Okay, well, I'll turn to Alan George from Oxford University. What's your view on this?
Well, one has to look at the nature of the Libyan economy. It's an oil state. Oil accounts for more than 90% of national income, however measured. Now, I'm very surprised at the suggestion that the Libyan economy was booming under Gaddafi. Oil was being produced, it was being sold, But the fact of the matter is the Gaddafi regime wasted vast resources, not least on Russian arms, when they bothered to pay for them, that is. The Libyan economy, provided there's political stability, will stabilise. The oil will continue to flow. There's going to be a very substantial income from that oil. It's going to be an important market, as it was before. But I really think it's mistaken to portray the Gaddafi era as some sort of economic boom period. It was actually pathetic. When you compare Libya as an oil state with, for example, Kuwait or Abu Dhabi, states that had bigger populations sometimes, and what they managed to achieve, and you look at what was done in Libya, it was very, very disappointing.
Very true,
yes.
Actually, sorry. That's very true, and I totally agree with Dr. Allen here. The fact that under the Gaddafi's rule, the word blackmail used by Gaddafi to supply oil to who thinks is there is no respect in dealing. There is no respect for any country. If you don't like it, I'm gonna cut it off, and that's it. So and the fact, like Dr. Allen mentioned, the money or the revenue of the oil wasn't going back to the country and wasn't going back to the people of Libya. It's destroyed and wasted in many, like in arms and some investment in African countries. But the Libyan and the country is left under the line of poverty, if you know what I mean.
That's true, isn't it, Dmitry Babich? I mean, a lot of Gaddafi wasted huge amounts of oil revenue, and especially on Russian arms. And the problem, I guess, for Russia is that Libya will not want to do business. The new government in Libya will not want to do business with Moscow at all.
Well, it was quite clear that it's not only in Libya that we have problems with new governments coming to power, because I think it's quite natural. The Islamists in various countries hate the state of which their regimes were clients. In Israel, Islamists were anti-American because the United States supported Israel. In Syria, Islamists, even under Hafez Assad and long before, Islamists were anti-Soviet because the Soviet Union was the main ally of the regime there. So I think when the rebellion started in Libya, it was quite clear that because of Gaddafi's good relations with Moscow, we'll have problems with the new government. I don't think Moscow had any illusions about it.
Okay.
But still, I would say that Libya did not waste on Russian arms more money than Saudi Arabia or Qatar wasted on American arms. I don't see here any big difference.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia. We're discussing the Libyan election. Dr. Alan George from Oxford University, Dmitry Babich on the line in Moscow, Voice of Russia's in-house observer, and Nureddin Waiheishi, a member of the Libyan community in London. What will be the focus, Nureddin Waiheishi, of the new constitution? Will the focus be on the role of religion in the government? Will the focus be on women's rights, for instance? Or will the focus also be on ensuring that another Gaddafi-like figure doesn't come into power?
We'll cover all those points. The constitution is going to be, hopefully, I mean, the new government or the new assembly is going to have two priority here. The first one, to appoint interim government for a year. The second one is to draft the constitution, and when they draft the constitution, they have to pass it to people to agree in it. And the constitution, hopefully, of Libya, it will cover all this, cover a human right. It covered religion, it covered relationship with other countries, covered the economy of the country, it covered, hopefully it will make sure not a figure like Gaddafi will come back to Libya again.
It's going to take a lot, but it took a lot longer than something like 120 days, which they're going to set for this constitution. I mean, is that really possible that a strong constitution can be created in such a short period of time?
Well, it's going to be a challenge, clearly. Equally, I think it's not difficult to predict the broad shape of the constitution. It will define clearly the limits of power on the president, if there's going to be a president, and we'll see what the constitution says on that. It will call for the independence of the judiciary.
Yes.
It will state that Islam is a major source of law. It's likely to be a fusion of European and Islamic law, as in neighbouring countries. Human rights will be guaranteed. democracy in the sense of elections will be guaranteed. I expect it will be a wonderful document. How it will play out in practice, as we've discussed earlier, is of course going to be another question, because in the end, democracy is a matter of culture, political culture. Everybody has to agree to play by the rules. If you've got armed groups, for example, that don't wish to play by the rules, they can cause a degree of havoc. That's why when I speak of my optimism, I say it's guarded or cautious optimism. There are enormous challenges, and I think holding one vote, as Dmitry said, or drafting a very fine constitution in and of themselves are not going to necessarily solve the problems, which doesn't mean that they are not essential steps.
I'll just quickly turn to you, Nureddin. You say the NFA announced it would sue Libya's most senior Muslim cleric for issuing a pre-election fatwa against the party. Do you see these kinds of settling of scores part of the process in the coming weeks and months?
That is democracy, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And with democracy, you have to listen to everybody, even the foolish. And those sort of things in the democratic world, it will happen. You you have the right to go to the law and sue whoever think done wrong by you. So probably it will. And like Dr. Allen said, the culture as well, democratic culture, is very, very important. And the Libyan, they're only going to learn that culture by holding election year after year and going through those processes. And this is how they're going to learn, and they're going to live the culture of the democracy.
I'll just draw your attention, actually, just finally, a quote from last September, actually, by Mustafa Abdel Jalil, the Libyan interim president. He said last September, "No retribution, no taking matters into your own hands, and no oppression. I hope the revolution will not stumble because of any of these things." Just briefly, the future of Libya. After what we saw people go into the ballot box, they had ink on their fingers for the first time in generations. How do you see the future of Libya?
I'm very optimistic. I think this is the right step. This is the first step, or it's a giant step, like they said, and we made that step, and I think the future is very, very bright.
And Dr. Alan George, reason for confidence for the West?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I think with a fair wind, Libya could evolve into a functioning democracy. I think it's also important to look at regions like Europe. Democracy did not just drop from the sky overnight. Yeah. It was hundreds of years process. I'm not saying in Libya it will take hundreds of years, but it is a process. It is an evolution. So guarded optimism.
And Dmitry Babich, finally in Moscow, guarded optimism surely from you over the scenes last weekend.
Well, I hope the situation won't get worse than it was during the civil war, and I hope Libyan society will move to some sort of compromise between various factions, and that all opinions will be allowed, including anti-revolutionary ones.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much. I'd like to end by thanking all my guests. Nureddin Waiheishi, he's a member of the Libyan community, exiled in London for 30 years. Dr. Alan George, Senior Associate Member at St. Antony's College. And Dmitry Babich, Voice of Russia's commentator in Moscow. Thank you very much for joining me here on The Voice of Russia.